Let's now welcome Stephen Matteson. I'm sure all of you have already read the work of Steve Matteson because he's a typeface designer and he drew a lot of the fonts that you use every day. Fonts for OpenOffice, fonts for Android, fonts for the Xbox, plenty of others. And today, Stephen, I think you will speak about the influence of technology on font design. And the mic is yours.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation back this year. It's a pleasure to be part of your community again. So yeah, I think I'll just go right ahead into this quote that kind of got me started. Today's type designer ought to aim to design typefaces for specific needs. It's a quote from Chuck Bigelow, who I met in 1987 when he received the Gaudy Award at RIT. It was an epiphany for me as a student. I'd already fallen hopelessly in love with letters and typography and lettering, but where does an up-and-coming student fit in? After all, as a student, you study 2,000 years of letter forms and you think it's all been done. There's no way I can do any better or improve upon the achievements of the masters. And typeface design in general has kind of evolved in a parallel course with the changes in the way in which technology reproduces them. With each technology change, we as type designers have to think about what were the best examples of design using the previous technologies. And with this understanding, we can improve upon designs for the future. When I started working with the latest desktop publishing tools at school and then in work, I could see it was obvious that not all typefaces could hold up to the limitations of resolution. The imaging technologies were obviously quite crude at that time for the consumer and desktop publishers. You could design new typefaces, like new bitmap fonts that were basically useful for one size only and sometimes only on one device. You could design a new family like Chuck Bigelow did and Chris Holmes, the Lucidif family, which was really kind of initially designed to stand up to this low resolution challenges of really kind of crufty 300 DPI laser printers. Or you can imagine all the old typefaces being adapted for new technologies. And this is where I quickly found that where I belonged at the time. By the time I worked on Microsoft's core fonts for TrueType in the TrueType format, it was already the third time in my short career that I've been making Times New Roman again for a different technology. So in this talk, I'm going to give a look at essentially three different aspects of type design that are relevant and challenge us type designers to come up with new solutions and sometimes old solutions to new problems. Ligatures are connected letter forms. They're either correcting a collision of one letter into another, or sometimes they just simply make a more elegant letter form combination. I'll be looking at kerning, the space between pairs of letters, and finally imaging. How do these letters reproduce under various conditions, whether it's a printed letterpress 500 years ago, or whether it's a letter being shown through an RGB filter on a piece of glass that's held in your hand. All of these topics can be seen in this one beautiful page. This is Jensen's typeface of 1470, roughly. And the typeface itself is a typeface that launched 100 different interpretations of this style of letter form. But what Jensen did here was he was modeling his letter form after a humanist bookhand written in calligraphic bookhand. And this is kind of my first reference to a type designer looking at the past or contemporary examples of beautiful quality. But in this case, you can see some kerning pairs. I've highlighted the CT ligature and the long ST and the long SS ligatures. These are just simply letter forms that are connected to form an elegant combination. Also in this Jensen example, you can see kerning, or actually the lack thereof, here between the T and the E. The process of hand setting type is already quite tedious, and having to kern every gap in 12-point type would be beyond the pale. Now the QU below that, they might look like they were kerned, but it was probably cast as one individual sort, a Q and a U together, to elegantly connect the tail of the Q underneath the U. So it was cast as a separate sort, not as a, and you didn't cut away any letter form to kern them together. So it's common practice because the QU appears so much in Latin. And then finally, you look at the Jensen text and you can see that it's a 550-year-old page, but it reproduces beautifully, especially, when you don't zoom it in like this, it just reads very beautifully, even in color, and just really great typesetting. But what you can see here is what was common back then is when letter forms, a piece of soft metal gets damaged, or if a little piece of the type doesn't quite get enough ink on it. So you do get some variation in how the letters reproduce. But this is kind of what I mean by the imaging aspect of the talk here. So let's talk about ligatures. When a learned observer of the Gutenberg Bible, basically the first comment is how beautifully the columns are aligned and justified. And Gutenberg went to great lengths to make great paper, smooth enough to print on, ink that was really black, that looked like the ink that the scribes would be using. And it's typeset so carefully in a way that even leaving room for the rubricators to come in later and highlight these red initial caps after the black ink was dry. It's just really going above and beyond in almost every way imaginable. And on top of that, he cast 290 or so sorts, not just the 26 letters of the alphabet, but all of these different variations of 2 and sometimes 3 characters pushed together or arranged or designed slightly differently to help him get a nice even line of justification. They gave him a lot of options. You can change the space between the letter forms, but you could also choose from all of these different sorts to get a nice, clean justification in text. And again, he's trying to mimic what the scribes had been doing for years before him. You can jump 100 years forward and you see another great example of ligatures, in this case mimicking the Greek script. Christopher Plantin's Polyglot Bible is shown here with Greek. I've got 3 ligatures highlighted. There's the first one being an alpha upsilon tau, I believe, and then an alpha rho, and then a delta iota ligature. And if you really look at this page, you probably find many others where these characters are made into very elegant combinations to sort of mimic what somebody would do writing this by hand. For the Latin alphabet post-Gutenberg, we have a much more basic set of ligatures. The characters which are problematic, like the QU, like I said, could be cast as a single letter, or they could be, kerned, but they could also be cast as a single ligature like this. But most often you would see the graceful long F or the long S being used in the ligatured form so that it wouldn't collide with the dot of the I or the following ascender of the H and the L. When the linotype machine was invented in 1884, a lot of these long, graceful characters were sort of subdued a bit. You can see that this F is much more upright and narrow. And that's because the linotype machine didn't allow for this sort of overlapping. They had fewer characters could be keyboarded in. So what would happen is a keyboard operator, a linotype keyboard operator, would insert ligatures manually. And because they were being used for newspapers, that usually took too much time, and you would just go ahead and type an F and an I without doing an FI ligature inserted manually. It was a sort of a giving up to the speed of mechanization. The release of the monotype keyboard and caster 13 years later reintroduced ligatures to the mechanized workflow. You could actually keyboard a ligature right from the keyboard right into the flow of text. And For this and other reasons, the monotype machine was preferred for fine book publishing. And again, looking to the past to restore kind of a lost aesthetic, or a nearly lost aesthetic. And of course, we have two contemporary examples, which kind of bring us back to Plantin's and Gutenberg's attempt at mimicking handwriting through the use of ligatures, among many other design tricks, of course. But John Hudson's tour de force, Gabriola, has over 4,500 characters in the single font. Of course, it includes Greek, Cyrillic, and Latin, but his font is unique in that it has, I believe, over 100 F ligatures, basically to account for every possible scenario, and swash versions of Fs. And his beautifully comprehensive Greek is similar to Plantin's in that as many as 3 characters are ligated together to form a more elegant combination within a word. Hermann Zaffino only covers the Latin character set, so it has quite a few fewer characters than Gabriola, but it's no less complex in terms of the number of ligatures provided. This is a connected script, and sort of the whole idea of this is to look like handwriting, and with all these ligatures to make it look like handwriting, to help fool the reader into thinking that a document was written specifically for him or her. Who better to concoct such a scheme than a master calligrapher such as the late professor? And I'm having problems advancing the slide, of course. Here we go, kerning. As I alluded to in the Jensen example, kerning was once a physical and time-consuming process to cut wood or lead away from the shoulder of the letter form so that the letter forms fit together neatly. You required a very steady hand and a good saw and file. I experienced this firsthand in our once great letterpress printing lab at RIT when, just as the professor walked in, there was a loud ping sound as a piece of type ricocheted out of a power saw. The lab assistant was admonished for attempting to miter a small piece of metal type. He had lost his grip, but luckily not any of his fingers. And this is a lovely example from Star Shape Press. Used in an article she wrote for her blog that says, let's hear it for the kern. And it shows the amount of material required to remove from a piece of wood or metal type. It's pretty significant. And in some cases, it makes the letter form unstable. And of course, this example is great because it shows that even the kerned pair of AV and A on the second line, it shows it's quite imperfect. It's not evenly spaced on either side of the V. And then, of course, you do also have to space out the I and the L to compensate for that openness of the A and the V. So not all kerning is perfect. Just because they're there doesn't mean they're, these kern pairs are there, doesn't mean they're actually an improvement. In fact, kerning, as often as not, could make things worse in display typography, where not every piece of type is notched to interlock. Here I have the word talking, I believe, is completely unkerned, and it looks much better than the word below it, which actually looks like le aves, because the A and the V are so close together. Things quickly changed with photo typesetting. There was basically it's very easy comparatively to kern. You just sort of reverse or advance the film strip, expose a character, and then move on. There's really no risk of losing a finger. Tight not touching is kind of one descriptor of this style of typography that just ran amok during the 70s and 80s. Some called it sexy spacing. Whatever you called it, this style dominated the scene for nearly two decades. And I should point out that I call it kerning and not just tracking, as in tightening up an entire line or loosening an entire line. It's kerning if it's done right, because every combination is slightly different. Or if it's done right, they're going to be slightly different. And the master of this style was Herb Lubalin. As a lettering artist, he really knew what he was doing when it came to interlocking and fitting letters. In the case of this, his avant-garde typeface, he nudged letters so close together, he needed a huge set of ligatures of overlapping, intertwining, intermingling shapes to get the effect he wanted. Sexy spacing indeed. By the time desktop publishing was taking off, the sexy spacing shtick was overdone, even farcical. In this case, if you got a headline, just keep hitting the minus button in your tracking window and it'll close up the headline to fit, rather than just thinking about maybe using a condensed typeface or a smaller point size to make your headline fit. When I was writing this talk, I got a little curious and I just Googled kerning just to see what I came up with at 4.4 million hits. And mostly it seems these hits were, or these articles and topics were created by people who have never actually designed a typeface in their lives. All these rules and steps written by people with perhaps no practical experience at all. Thank you, Internet. But my favorite piece of advice here is kerning. It's not always a good thing. And it's from a communication arts article that I haven't yet read, but it gives me some hope that there is basically kerning is, it can work or it may not. As far as my own thoughts and approaches to kerning, I go in with the understanding that kerning is not a cure-all. You can improve the basic rhythm of a typeface, but it's impossible to solve the balance of every imaginable scenario, even in my own name. In fact, I vividly remember being given a drawer of 72-point type in my typography class, and the professor saying, okay, you need to set your name in all caps in 72-point metal. And then he realized my last name was Matteson and thought, oh, you're going to have fun with this one. Meaning, of course, the big gap of the two T's together in the middle of my name and trying to balance out the other letters accordingly. So when I kern a typeface, I think my own name is probably not, doesn't look as good as it could. I would set it slightly different by opening up the A and the T slightly and opening up ESON as well, just to compensate for that big wide gap in the middle of the two T's. The beauty now, of course, is the fact that we can kern every single letter in every conceivable accented version of that character. It really is great. The consistency is far beyond what, for example, you could see in that wood type AVA kerned, where it was unbalanced on each side. We really have a lot of control over this now. And it's to the point where we kern the way a lettering artist would write their name with, or their words with perfect balance in each case. And finally, I'll discuss imaging of type and how it's affected type design. We've really had a good look at Jensen and Gutenberg, so let's jump ahead a bit to 1501. When one speaks of beautiful books and beautiful typography, it's pretty easy to get swept away with Aldus Manutius, Virgil, and Horace editions. These are the first use of italic types. The entire books were set in italics. They were cut by Francesco Griffo, who probably was basing it on pre-Carolinian calligraphic hands like those of Giovanni Tagliente. But these calligraphic italics were very popular in the Renaissance, and they reproduced really well as types. They allowed more words per line, so there's an economy there as far as how much vellum to use here. It prints very smoothly. It's a gorgeous type to behold. The thin strokes are not too thin. The straight strokes in their angle create a beautiful rhythm, and the color is very, very even in color. In 1788, Giambattista Bedoni printed his specimen of typefaces, about 140 individually cut types, individually sizes of types cut. The Manuale, as it's called, clearly shows the contemporary fashion of upright stress and extreme thick, thin contrast. But it also illustrates an important reality that people in today's digital world forget. In this case, each type size is slightly different in design. It's cut by hand for maximum style and legibility and proportion. So for instance, if you were to set Bedoni's display from the previous page, in text, you see on the left a very wobbly, very compressed, difficult to read text face. Whereas Bedoni's text size, in this case, you can see it's much more regular and it's much more legible given the spacing and everything else. And conversely, if you were to set the text size as big as the display size, you'd see how heavy the hairlines are in order that they wouldn't break up at the small size they'd be printed at. ITC's Bedoni claims to be entirely accurate to the punches that Bedoni cut for 16, 12, and 72. I remain a little bit dubious about this, though. I haven't had the pleasure to going to Parma, Italy to see for myself. But in any case, ITC's Bedoni is a good example of showing how different the text sizes need to be in order to read well. And just another example of this, Monotype's Wahlbaum, you can see how the display typeface, if it was used in the text sizes, really just kind of blows away. The hairlines blow away. And the text size, while it retains the same flavor of the display, is much easier to read. Now, back to Times New Roman, as I mentioned earlier, originally, eventually, the metal version of Times New Roman had 30 different size masters cut from 5 point to over 72. I think it's in the 100-point range. It's clearly, when you look at the typeface like this in the catalog, you might get struck by how legible the metal Times is at 5 point and how elegant it is at 72 point versus the digital version. You really can't get that kind of spread of quality without cutting or drawing a specific size. The digital version of Times was based on the 14 point, which I believe is the second column close to the bottom. And to me, I like to call it as Times average because Times New average. It's reliable in text and it looks okay in display, but it really lacks the elegance in display, and it's not quite as legible at the really small sizes as the metal version. And these three photographs are of the display, the text, and then if you look at the 5 point master at the bottom, how much of a difference you get with cutting these small sizes with an extreme amount of extra white space, a much taller X height, and a heavier stem width than you have for the same Roman weight and the display size. The Monotype archive is really amazing. They have every drawing of every size of every typeface ever released by Monotype. And I found this lovely illustration of three sizes overlaid. This G is from a typeface called Spectrum by Jan van Krimpen. And the blue, the tallest, is the smallest size master. So it was the 6 point size. It's a little bit heavier in weight, a little taller, larger in X height. And if you see the six vertical lines, 3 on each side, you can see that the text size is much more widely spaced than the 12 point. So 6, 8, and 12 point masters overlaid, and very, very subtle adjustments to make that read as best it can. So this notion of making designs for specific sizes or size ranges is what drew me into the e-reader boom. Seeing how really well designs that were made specifically for print really fall apart in digital products encouraged me to look at size masters to help remedy the situation. The problem with e-readers initially was not just of low resolution, but the poor contrast of e-ink screens added to the deformation of letter forms. I think one engineer told me that white was actually about 70% gray in the best scenario. So you can imagine the black, which isn't really very black, and then the gray background is very disruptive to the quality of type. Now, Amazon had made a pretty good, solid decision choosing Thesis Serif by Lucas de Groot. It had humanist book proportions, was monolinear with sturdy serifs. It really rendered pretty well on the Kindle. In fact, many typefaces with these similar qualities, like Rockwell or Stymie, they're very geometric and not really good for reading extended text. So when Barnes and Noble approached me to start developing their competing product, the Nook, I immediately suggested that what I thought were outstanding low-resolution text faces, Lucida and Georgia. The results were both really bad, and you'd never been able to predict that, how bad they would be, without actually seeing the product firsthand. You can see here Georgia, which was kind of the default email font for reading on screen for so long from Microsoft, and designed by Matthew Carter. You can see how thin the thin strokes become, and they were literally just blowing out. I don't have, unfortunately, a photo of Lucida, but Lucida became almost a stencil design, where the joins into main stems became so thin they almost dropped out and looked like stencils. So what I decided on was to look at Amesys, another monotype design. And you can see, I think if I go back and forth, that there is an improvement to the light and dark contrast, but it really wasn't enough for the Kindle product owners. And so what I ended up doing was creating a e-paper specific version of Amesys by increasing the X height slightly and increasing the hairline weight. The thin strokes became thicker. And I also increased the spacing, which is hard to see here because it's a justified page and some of the letters do get a little tight. But we got something that was quite serviceable, and the Nook launched and was quite popular. Now the Nook has a much higher resolution screen. I think it's 300 dpi. The paper white screen boasts being about 90% white, so very close to being white compared to the original. And this allows them to ship a lot more fonts within the reader, a lot more typeface designs that are sturdy enough to render on these devices. So they came a long way with the technology in less than 10 years. At the same time all of this was going on with e-paper, LCDs were gaining in pixel density. LCD monitors, however, varied a great deal from one another from a hardware standpoint. And to complicate things further, every platform, browser, and some apps all rendered type differently. And you can see in the 4 lines where it says rasterizer specific, this is the typeface Verdana, which looks very, very different in each scenario. When I designed Seago for Microsoft's operating system in, I think, 2004, we were carefully analyzing how the letter forms looked under the ClearType rasterizer. And now, of course, the pixel densities have gotten so close, I think the ClearType rasterizer is only used in special situations anymore. When the iPad came out, Apple heralded their book application. They provided a menu of fonts chosen at random rather than by quality for reading on screen. I think only Palatino was the only one that was really pleasant to read. They offered monotype Baskerville, but it looked delicate and wan on the iPad screen. As you can see here, this is a screen grab from the first generation iPad, and it really is wanting for contrast. So again, I turned back to Size Masters for the solution. I looked at the drawings for Baskerville, and the Baskerville MT that's out there, I think, is also based on the 14-point master like Times. But for the e-text version of Baskerville, I looked at the 6-point drawing, which is much more robust and heavy and dark, has good contrast, taller X height. And the result was quite satisfactory in terms of aiding the failing version of Baskerville MT. So on the right-hand side, you have the Baskerville e-text that I drew. And as things go with Apple, the advice to switch fonts fell on deaf ears. But fortunately, both Amazon and Barnes & Noble picked up the design and used it in their e-readers. Jeff Bezos, apparently in an unprecedented nod to fonts, remarked with fascination that the font he was showing an audience was from the 18th century. But for all that work putting good fonts into devices, we still have to put up with stultifyingly dull typography of e-readers, horrible hyphenation justification, and even sometimes a flying drop capital. And looking at e-readers today, this Libby library ebook application for public libraries, they have few very good type choices, and sometimes they pull out the oldest trick in the book, saying they have a bold weight of a font, but actually the application is altering the regular into a pseudo bold. Literally, the rasterizer smears in the X direction the bitmap, and you get a slightly darker image, but you also get this effect of the letters becoming further apart, and characters like the A and the W getting very, very dark compared to the other letters. I highlighted, you can kind of see the word firefighter, which has two ligatures in it. And the ligature, since it's a combination of letters, when the letter spacing occurs from the emboldening, the F and the I don't get any further apart, but every other letter in the word does. So you get this very uneven flowing of text. So for all the problems that crop up, it's nice to know that companies like Microsoft, for example, still appreciate the value of good fonts. Last year, they launched 5 new designs to augment their Office applications. And they're not just new fonts for the sake of new fonts. Their purpose was to expand their font menu into genres that they didn't really support very much before. Particularly great is their attention to purpose. Size-specific designs for each of these families are included, including my Bierstadt. And not only is there a display version of each font, most useful for PowerPoint presentations, but we've looked at how many characters can you fit in an Excel spreadsheet in a cell? Can you compress it enough without losing legibility? And what's that fine balance point of becoming too tight versus showing a lot of information in a single spreadsheet cell? And I'll just show a quick example. This is an example of, say, PowerPoint using my Bierstadt bold typeface in the headlines. But using the display, you get a little bit more compact, maybe impactful display. The letters are a little bit narrower and they're definitely closer together. So you get, this is kind of, I'll show again before and after, this kind of maybe undefinably impactful, and this is more definably impactful in the display. So I'll leave you this quote from Jan Tschichold. It's a profound quote in many ways to me, since type design is an aggregate of many, many detailed decisions which all affect the performance of the type, be it legibility or fashion or both. And though we may be armed with the most advanced fonts and authoring tools ever known, it feels like a constant battle to raise the bar of quality, beauty, and function. With the technology landscape continually changing, there will always be problems for type designers to be solving, typographers as well. And I barely scratched the surface here, and I've not even mentioned writing systems other than Latin. So the next generation of type designers can look at Mr. Bigelow's words from 1987 and rest assured that there's plenty of work ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm open to questions if we have time.
We have time. We have a lot of time for question, discussion, comments. Who would like to start? Boris, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
A moment.
Yeah, say something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Sorry. First, thanks for absolutely great talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question. You demonstrated a lot of typographic problems with ebooks. And my question is it possible, what do you think, to create or use the existing ebook format for good quality of electronic books? Or should we just go with reading PDF from screen?
That is a great question, because I asked myself that, and I asked a couple of ebook designers, you know, can you point me to examples of really great ebook publishing? Because I'm giving this talk, I'd like to be able to point to some great examples. And I got basically, I don't know. I think they both agreed that the ebook publishing format is very difficult to work in and create something that's going to be universally read the same, you know, on every device. And basically that was their way of saying, yeah, I think you pretty much have to still live with PDFs to really preserve the, you know, that kind of quality. On the other hand, I know how powerful CSS is. I've seen it demonstrated, you know, to me that you can make very, very good typography with advanced CSS features. So I, not being fluent or at all, you know, able to create typography with the ebook languages myself, I just haven't seen it, you know, but I do feel like there's the possibility, the potential there. I just don't know what the answer is to pull it all together into you know, a consistently good readable format. That's a long answer. I'm sorry. Basically, I don't know. I wish there was the case. Yes.
Yeah. We all wish.
Anyone else?
I just would like to mention to all the Texans over there, in a recent conversation with Steve, he let me know that he hasn't seen mathematics being typeset with Node 2 yet. And,
Yes.
And so we're making some templates for him, you know, being typeset by tech, by Word, by InDesign, so that he can appreciate, you know, the underlying work of the font and the work of the typesetter on top of his own work.
Yes.
And, if you want to contribute to that effort, please send me a page on your preferred typesetter. Could be anything, could be InDesign, could be Word, could be whatever, you know, we'll select it, put it in a PDF and send it over to him.
Yeah, that's the thing, is it's very rewarding to see great examples of your typefaces being used, because I'm creating tools for the designers and typesetters, and whenever you see a really great usage of the type, it's always a real wonderful thing. And I was, you know, talk about the quote from Chuck Bigelow about designing typefaces for specific needs. That combined with the previous talk about music typesetting, the first typeface I ever did was a music notation typeface. And you talk for Atari software back in 88, 89. And you talk about designing for a very specific need. That was a perfect example of it. And that commission came through Chuck Bigelow and Chris Holmes, and they were very helpful in learning the tools and how to you know, draw a typeface that would work for this specific need. And because I had a musical background, and so did my design partner, we were, really excited about that opportunity. And it really kind of, pointed me to the how true it is that we're really creating specific typefaces, specific solutions.
That may just be a feeling, but from your talk, a problem could be the lack of communication between the typeface designer and the users of the face.
Yes, yeah, very much so. Oftentimes, I use the Seago as an example, the font used for Microsoft's user interface. It was very much a dialogue, and looking at the typeface used in the specific setting. And that was a very controlled environment, whereas releasing a typeface to the mass market, you really have no control over where it might be implemented.
In the chat, there is a question from Manfred. What is your preferred tool to design a typeface?
That's a really, really easy question. I use Glyphs app. Glyphsapp.com is their website. I have said numerous times that if I had that tool exactly as it is now, 30 years ago when I started doing this work, or 30 some odd years ago, my work would be much higher quality and much more prolific. It is just hands down the best available tool. And along with the tool, the community around it, like I think probably similar to the tech community, the tool of support, I mean, the community of support around the tool is really, really far reaching and very, very friendly at sharing secrets and stuff. Design secrets or methods and things. So yeah, if you do get into this sort of thing, Glyphs is really wonderful in that regard.
Are there other questions? You can just raise your hand and I will open your mic. And when the technology, for example, for displays, when the technology is limiting, is it worth putting a lot of effort in having a font solving the problem while 5 or 10 years later, the technology will have improved? And just that will be 5 years to wait.
Yeah. There's many cases where you will look at something made for an earlier technology and it's not appropriate anymore, or just doesn't solve the problem anymore. And just the whole fact of the pixel densities of screens changing so quickly, it's not necessarily taken away the need for some of the adaptations for lower resolutions, because you can still set very small text on a high pixel density screen and not be able to read it very well. And the older solution for the lower resolution comes in and is useful. So you can see solutions not being relevant anymore, but also some solutions that are still quite relevant.
That's the last chance to ask a question before we close the session.
Well, in case somebody wakes up in the middle of the night with a question or they run into a type problem, I think my contact information was up long enough for anybody to reach me for a question offline. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for this great talk, really inspiring. And I will be really happy to watch it again when it's really on YouTube.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, regarding the contact information, that's true for all the speakers. If you missed the email of a speaker, you can write to the conference committee, and we'll ask permission to the speaker to pass their email, and so we can put people in contact very easily. So do not hesitate. We are here. The conference is here for people to exchange ideas, comments. So we will do our best to facilitate that. Thank you again, Stephen.